Good morning. Really glad that you're here this morning. It's great to be together today. Going to be continuing in the Gospel of John this morning. If you want to go ahead and be turning there, getting down to the very end of this Gospel, John 18 and 19. So where we're going to be this morning as we spend the last few weeks of this year looking at the last few pages of this great Gospel. I invite you to turn there. In my childhood, if you had 3 people and you wanted to kill some time, one of the go-to games was called Monkey in the Middle. How many of you have ever played Monkey in the Middle before? Also known as Keep Away. It's a very simple game, of course. The whole game revolves around 2 people standing at one end or another end of a hallway, for example, and the third player stands in between. And the whole object of the game is for player 1 and player 2 to throw some item, a ball or something, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth without player 3, who's in the middle, intercepting the ball or whatever it is. I'm certain you know how it's played. And I remember countless hours that I spent after school in the elementary school hallway playing Monkey in the Middle while my mom finished grading papers and I waited to go home. I guess this might be a teacher-kid thing. But I remember we also did not have a ball to play with, so what we did is we took those little Kleenex packets that you stick in your pocket, and we wrapped them with tape in like a 2x4 rectangle, like a makeshift football for desperate third graders. And we go out in the hallway, and I remember just how quickly that game could turn from lots of fun to helpless frustration if you were the one who was stuck in the middle, and your older brother and the surprisingly agile third grade girl whose mom taught across the hall we're making you go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and all the while that Kleenex football just sailed right above your head, right beyond the reach of your fingertips. That is a desperate place to be. And it reminds me in a way of the desperate place that we find Pilate in John chapter 18 and 19. Pilate, of course, if you're not familiar with Pilate, Pilate was the governor that Rome put in charge of the city of Jerusalem during the days of Christ, and most importantly, during the last days of Christ, when Christ was arrested, like we saw last week, and when Christ was put on trial. Ultimately, when Christ was put on trial, it was Pilate before whom he would stand as his judge. And as Pilate faces the most important decision of his life, what maybe some people would call the most important decision in human history, Pilate finds himself in a way in a high-stakes game of Monkey in the Middle, going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between Jesus and an angry mob. And the question is, will he catch on to the truth? Or will it just sail above his head, just beyond his reach? This is Pilate's predicament. But you know what? It's not just Pilate's predicament. Pilate's problem and the decision that he faces, maybe it's a story for all of us about the trouble of standing in between. Let's take a look and find out. It is John chapter 18. The story begins in verse 28 of John 18, and it actually carries on through the end of that chapter and about halfway through John 19, down to verse 16. So we have a pretty big story to work with this morning, and I want to read a lot of this story to you today. And as I read this, I want you to pay special attention to Pilate's footsteps. I want you to follow the path that Pilate takes as he goes back and forth. And inside and outside of the governor's headquarters, a building that was called the Praetorium, I want you to watch as he goes back and forth and back and forth. Follow his footsteps. Because in many ways, the path of Pilate's footsteps tells the story of his heart. Because try as he might to be neutral and just stay out of it and just be indifferent, and try he will, Pilate is stuck in between. And at some point or another, he's going to have to answer the question, what am I going to do with Jesus? So let's look at the story together. Verse 28 sets the scene. Then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters, and it was early in the morning, and they themselves, this is talking about those who had arrested and are now accusing Jesus and bringing him to trial, they themselves did not enter Pilate's headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. So what we have here are Christ's accusers, those chief priests and scribes, and those who have brought this plot against Jesus. They're standing outside of the praetorium. They are all standing and gathered on the doorstep of Pilate's headquarters, and they won't go in. Why? Because apparently if they go in, they would be ritually unclean. So if this verse sets the stage for the story, it starts out this story with a lot of irony about to be unfolded, because apparently these folks are okay with killing an innocent man, much less the Messiah. They can come to terms with that. But they're not going to walk through this door and be unclean and not be able to eat the Passover. So that's the situation going on here. And that sets the stage for the story that follows, because if Pilate is going to talk to this angry mob at his doorstep, he's going to have to go out to speak to them. And that's exactly what he does. Follow his footsteps through this story. So Pilate went out to them and he said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Which I don't know if you noticed, but that's not really an accusation, is it? It's really more just like, he's bad news, trust me. They don't really bring a charge against him at this point. And I wonder if Pilate is thinking this is a little bit fishy. Because from this point forward, we're going to see what happens time and time again, and that's that Pilate doesn't really want to have anything to do with this. Pilate just wants to be neutral. Pilate just wants to leave this alone, and so he replies to them, "Okay, if that's the accusation you're bringing," Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." I don't want to deal with this, Pilate says. But then the truth comes out. The reason that they're troubling Pilate with this at all, they replied to Pilate, "But we are not permitted to put anyone to death. Only a Roman can do that." Pilate, only you can do that. And suddenly you see how the spotlight has turned squarely upon Pilate, because he's the one who can make this decision that they're asking him to make. So here they are, they're standing at the doorstep. The angry mob has come to him. The accusers of Jesus, they're there at the door. The darkness that did not comprehend him, it's right there outside waiting for him. And they're pleading with Pilate, and they're saying, "You're the one who can make this choice. Side with us and crucify him." So Pilate goes outside and he hears their case. And then Pilate goes inside and he sees their king. He sees the one who they're saying is calling himself the King of the Jews. He sees the one who apparently is deserving to die. Follow his footsteps. Then Pilate went inside. He entered the headquarters again. He summoned Jesus and he asked him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And what does Jesus say? Well, yes and no. I'm a king, you got that much right. But I am not the king you expected. Verse 36, Jesus answered, and Scott read this a moment ago, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, I'm not the king you expected. My kingdom is not of this world. And Pilate asked him, so you are a king? Jesus said, you say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. And everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. So here we have Pilate. He's just been outside, and he's listened to the voice of the crowd. And now we have Pilate, he goes inside, and he listens to the voice of truth. Jesus says, I'm not the king you expected, but if you want to know the truth, I'm the voice you need to be listening to. Now, do you think that's what Pilate expected to find when he came inside and saw the man who deserved to die? What did he expect to see? Another rebel? Another Barabbas? Another false Messiah pretending and making claims? Another bug to be squashed? But what did he find instead? Here's this man, and he's not like the others. You look in his eyes, and he's not afraid. Here's this man, and he's promising the truth. And he's claiming to be a king that's not from this world. This has got to be very, very strange for Pilate, to be standing in between this decision. So Pilate asked him, what is truth? And people have wondered forever, and I still wonder today what Pilate means by that, whether he's being sarcastic, whether he's being genuine and he really wants to know. I can't tell you the answer to that. All I can tell you is that Pilate doesn't stick around long enough for the answer. Because as soon as Pilate had said this, follow his footsteps, he went out to the Jews again. He went outside of his headquarters again to hear the voice of the crowd rather than the voice of truth. And Christ has clearly made an impression on Pilate. In fact, the rest of that verse says that when he went out to that crowd, he said, I find no case against him. He doesn't want to condemn the man inside. But he also doesn't want to offend the voices outside either. And so he's stuck. And so he makes a choice, a bargain. I'm just going to put this in your hands. How's that sound? You decide. Verse 39, you have a custom that I release someone to you at the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? But they shouted in reply, not this man, but Barabbas. And Barabbas was, the word there translates a bandit. Probably shouldn't just think about a thief or a robber, though. More like a revolutionary. In those days, that word had even become kind of a technical term for those who claimed to be the Messiah and proved not to be. Jesus himself uses that same word in John 10 when he says, I'm the gate of the sheep, and all those who came before me are what? Thieves and robbers. Same word. He's talking about those who came before him claiming to be what he was, but they weren't. And now here they are at the moment of truth, and the crowd says, give us Barabbas, the false Messiah, rather than the one that God has given us, the Son of God. Again, this is just full of irony. I think I've mentioned it months ago, but Even that word Barabbas is ironic, because the word Barabbas means son of the Father. And here they choose the Son of the Father instead of the true Son of the Father, the Son of God. And you know what? It looks like for Pilate the problem is solved. The decision has been made. He passed it off, and guess what? They decided, and it's out of my hands now. And so Pilate goes back inside, and he took Jesus and had him flogged, and the soldiers wove a crown of thorns. They put it on his head. They dressed him in a purple robe. They kept coming to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and they were striking him on the face. And Pilate is watching these things, and suddenly, he's not so sure anymore. He's tried to pass off this decision. He thinks it's worked. But now he watches this thing happening before him. Maybe he's thinking back to what Jesus said before. Maybe he's remembering that look he saw in his eyes when he was unafraid before him. I don't know. But suddenly, Pilate is not so sure, and things are not sitting right with him. So, he's back to square one. And Pilate goes out again. Goes back outside again, and he says to them, "Look, I'm bringing him out with me this time. Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know again that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said, "Here is the man." And I kind of wonder if Pilate hopes that this humiliation will be enough, the end of it. But it's not enough. When the chief priests and the police saw this, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and crucify him," knowing that they couldn't do that. That's how desperate Pilate is at this point. He tells them to do something they are not allowed to do, just to get this off his plate. Because, and a third time he says it, "I find no case against him." Just let me stay out of this, says Pilate. Just let me be neutral. But what he finds is that there is no staying out of it. And maybe in that way, Pilate's predicament is the world's predicament. When Jesus and the truth look him in the eye, Pilate wants to avert his gaze. He's searching for neutral ground. He is looking for a way to be indifferent. But this gospel is not for the indifferent. This gospel is for those who would come to believe and have life in his name. And in the Gospel of John, there is darkness and there is light. And the voice of truth calls us not into the shadows of indifference. The voice of truth calls us into the light. But right now, Pilate is just helplessly in between. And the stakes are getting higher. The Jews answered him this time, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he claimed to be the Son of God." And this is new information to Pilate. All this time, Pilate's been thinking that he claimed to be a king in a way that he has. But now they're saying, no, not just a king. He is claimed to be divine. And when Pilate hears these words, that he claimed to be the Son of God, now he's more afraid than ever. And so, follow his footsteps, he entered into the headquarters again, and he asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But he gave him no answer. Jesus had given him an answer before. And now he waits to see what Pilate's going to do. So Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you? And I have the power to crucify you?" But Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." And we're told that from that point on, Pilate tried to release him. Like finally, Pilate is getting to this point where maybe he's ready to take a step out of the middle and he's ready to actually stand up for the voice of truth. Pilate tried to release him. But just as soon as Pilate starts to inch toward the light, the accusers hit him right where it hurts the most. His pride, his power, his position of honor. They ask him, "Pilate, just think about this. What are you willing to lose for this man?" And they say to him, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. You're no friend of the emperor, and everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." And when Pilate heard those words, "Follow his footsteps," he brought Jesus outside. He sat on the judge's